Please give Dan a warm welcome to the greatest podium in the Twin Cities.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and it's my pleasure to be here. And boy, my son, he just had a great year on that Rotary Fellowship. It was just great. And kind of as a parent, you know, it's the first time he's going to leave the house and he's going to be on his own. And I have to admit, I did feel quite a measure of security knowing he would have the Rotarians of Ambato sort of helping him out, helping him make his way. He had a great year. He was born in Colombia. We adopted him, so it was kind of a really, you know, and being an adopted kid, it's kind of a complex identity. So being down in Ecuador for a year kind of affirmed the South American part of him, and he's now a senior at the Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. So what else was I going to talk about today? Quite an election season, so let me just say a few things about what has led us to where we are. And then I'll leave some time for questions, and I'll leave some time, plenty of time to talk about the current election. I'd like us to think a little bit about it in the way some political scientists think about it. There's one school of thought in political science, contested school of thought, I should add, that suggests about once a generation, there's a kind of seismic shift in the way politics works. Political scientists call it a realigning election. It happens, usually there's an issue that the current party system can't handle. Sometimes the advent of third parties are kind of a canary in the coal mine of politics, a sort of sign that the existing regime isn't working. And there's usually some sort of crisis. And so if you look historically in the 20th century, a key example of this is 1932 with Franklin Roosevelt. So what do we have in Franklin Roosevelt? I think people sometimes forget, prior to Franklin Roosevelt, the Democratic Party was fairly weak. It was largely a party of the South, and in the North it was urban machines of big cities. That's about all. The whole period between Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt, the Democrats hardly ever won the presidency. I think Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson are the only winners. So what happens prior to 1932? There is plenty of third-party activity. Socialist parties, in Minnesota there's a Farmer Labor Party, and I think that suggests that the current regime isn't working. There's also this big crisis, the Great Depression. And so somehow there's this debate in the 1930s, and Franklin Roosevelt is able to prevail. As one kind of indicator of what the old regime looked at like, if you think about the election of 1928, so Al Smith runs against Herbert Hoover. Al Smith loses in a landslide. So he's the governor, Democratic governor of New York. He loses in a landslide. The only states he carries are Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia. Now imagine Hillary Clinton today, Democratic senator from New York, loses in a landslide. She probably won't. The only states she carries are Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia. Not in a million years. So in some ways, the political map, the map we see in blue and red on election eve, has essentially flipped in the last century. And the states that used to be red are now blue and vice versa. So what happens in 1932? Franklin Roosevelt pushes activist government, pushes a New Deal, includes Social Security, includes jobs programs. I remember growing up in Moorhead, Minnesota, we used to have family dinner conversations. They would often get kind of political, and we'd have the blue aunts and uncles on one end and the red on the other end. And the kind of when the Democrats were behind, they'd always pull out that the Republican uncles worked in these Roosevelt jobs programs, these public jobs programs, and they sort of thought that would kind of bring them to their knees, and they would become Republican. It never seemed to kind of work that way. So Roosevelt, he presides over a dominant period of American politics. So prior to Roosevelt, the Democrats are pretty weak, but from 32 onward, Democrats are a lot stronger. Roosevelt puts together this New Deal coalition, and for the first time, the Democrats are able to pick up states in the North. Roosevelt is the governor of New York, and he's able to strengthen the Democratic Party, and that's kind of the first part of this complete shift in American politics. It's not a complete automatic shift. So Minnesota, which had a pretty strong Republican Party in the middle century, and still somewhat strong today, but Minnesota goes for Eisenhower in the 1950s. I actually didn't look that up, so someone's going to have to look that up and check that out on me. But I was talking to an alum of St Olaf College, and he was a student at St Olaf in the 1950s, and he said they did a poll of St Olaf students, and they found it was about 75-25 Eisenhower over Stevenson. And I think now, today, it's about the opposite for Obama over Romney, or I'm not sure about Clinton and Trump. But we can talk about that later. So Roosevelt puts together this New Deal coalition: Southerners, labor unions, Baptists, Catholics, Jews. Someone said a genius of Franklin Roosevelt is that he was able to get the Christian fundamentalist truck driver from Alabama and the Jewish banker of New York both to support him ardently. And in a certain sense, that's part of what you try to do in politics. Is you try to, if you want to win, you try to stitch together these coalitions. You have to get a majority, or at least a plurality. And I would say that's not an easy task. And sometimes the reason why politics can become kind of messy is politicians are trying to stitch together that coalition. It's a little different than writing a song or writing a beautiful article where you just want to make it beautiful. If you're in politics, you want to get to 51%. You want to stitch together this coalition. You want to get diverse people to all support you. So the Democrats were quite successful in that. In that period also, of course, Roosevelt pushes these government programs, rather large government programs, like the GI Bill, Social Security, very popular, and part of what made the Democratic Party of that era really look like the champion of middle America. Things begin to change in the 1960s. One issue that emerges that leads to what some scholars would say would be another realigning or change period in American politics is the issue of race. Interestingly, for Roosevelt, was kind of conservative on race. There was federal anti-lynching legislation that came, or that was on the agenda when Roosevelt was president. He opposed it. And in 1960, when Nixon and Kennedy ran against each other, there were polls done at the time that said most of the public didn't see much difference between the two candidates on issues of race. I think there was one famous phone call that John Kennedy's brother Robert made to Coretta Scott King when Martin Luther King was in jail that some credit to tipping the election to Kennedy. But when Kennedy becomes president, he doesn't immediately become progressive on civil rights. He's going pretty slow, and it's not really until the March on Washington. And in fact, Kennedy urges King not to do the March on Washington, urges King and the civil rights movement to go slower. King, like Roosevelt, is trying to keep that coalition together, and the Democrats, to hold the presidency, they need to have the South. So the civil rights, or the March on Washington occurs, and then Kennedy is assassinated. Prior to his assassination, he introduces a civil rights bill, and Lyndon Johnson, probably another irony of American politics, Southern white politician, he introduces the civil rights bill as a kind of a tribute to the slain president. And he gives a great speech at one point in support of civil rights. And at the end of the speech, he ends up quoting a famous civil rights hymn, "Free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." And Martin Luther King says, never before has an American president articulated the pain and the struggles and the injustices that black people face. And Lyndon Johnson apparently went back to his office and said, well, I think I just lost the White House for the Democrats for the next quarter century. And in part, he may have been correct on that. In addition to issues of race, other issues were bubbling at the time. Vietnam was another one. And these were issues that there was ferment in both parties. And at the end of the 1960s, the Democrats come to take a less hawkish position on foreign policy. Richard Nixon, I think when he runs in 68 and 72, changes from the Richard Nixon who ran in 1960. George Wallace runs on a third-party ticket, which is another indicator that the existing two-party system isn't working. So in 1972, Nixon pushes a Southern strategy and was able to win most of the South. And probably that movement doesn't only happen in 1972. Barry Goldwater did the same thing, and he captured some Southern states in 1964. So these realigning elections don't happen all at once. But it is the beginning of a shift. And in the period after the 1960s, Democrats are struggling. They're seen as guardians of an overbearing welfare state. They're seen as not trustworthy to be commander-in-chief on foreign policy. They're seen as advocates of a lax crime policy. And I think it's in that period that the Republican Party becomes the champion of the middle class. Ronald Reagan famously says the era of big government is over. And so those are the kind of the defining issues of that period. So from the whole period between Nixon and Obama's election in 2008, the only Democrats who ever win the presidency are relatively conservative presidents, Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter. And Bill Clinton, in some ways, tries to attack Democratic weaknesses, pushes a tougher crime bill, comes out in favor of capital punishment, has an economic policy that does have some tax increases in it, but also is an advocate of free trade. In terms of issues of race, he distances himself from Jesse Jackson, and Bill Clinton becomes one of the more successful Democratic politicians in the 1990s. I think there was another moment in the 92 campaign when Bill Clinton orchestrated a moment where he could dispute. There was a rap singer, Sister Souljah, who had a song, Cop Killer. And Bill Clinton arranged to be on stage when she was performing and criticized her, rebuked her. And that was part of the effort to kind of recapture middle America. Interestingly, the welfare state that Democrats at the time were overbearing were generally means-tested programs. The big programs that Roosevelt pushed, largely Social Security and the GI Bill, still remain popular. Well, the GI Bill sort of phased out, but Social Security remains one of our most popular and one of our largest government programs. So something happens, or seems to happen, or begins to happen in the 21st century. Barack Obama wins the presidency. Another element of these realigning elections is also demography. And so Mitt Romney captures about the same percentage of the white vote in 2012 as Ronald Reagan does in the 1980s, except Mitt Romney loses and Ronald Reagan wins. So the changing demography is changing the contours of American politics. So if you look at the era of today, what kind of changes do we expect to see, or what are we looking at? I think there is another sense in which, if you look at the era that preceded this, it was a different kind of era. There were probably another aspect of the prior era are conservative religious movements, particularly the reaction to Roe versus Wade. So the Republican formula that won in the late 20th century was to be conservative on social issues, to be strong on defense, and to be ardently in favor of tax cuts. Democrats in that era also didn't push tax cuts that often. In fact, it's only until the 21st century that the Democrats are beginning to push some tax increases. So that is a kind of change. I remember in the 1980s, up in northern Minnesota, if you went to a Democratic Party convention, about half of it was pro-life. A lot of it was from the northern part of the state, but I remember even talking to someone who went to a meeting in western Minnesota, half of the Democratic Party was pro-life. Half of them were conservative on social issues. And so gradually there's kind of a shifting around, and gradually you see this polarization in American politics. And a lot of it has to do also with the decline of liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats. Some of that happens, I think, in the Republican Party because of social issues. And I think you can really see that in Minnesota. The Republican Party has changed. The Republican Party of the 60s and 70s of Harold Lavander and Al Quie and people like that tended to be a moderate Republican Party. And I think with the advent of the Christian right, with the advent of a strong social movement that formed a bedrock of the Republican Party, I think that did lead to the decline in liberal Republicans. And I think some of the changes in civil rights led to the decline of conservative Democrats as well. So in some sense, I think today parties are more coherent, but they're also more polarized. And I think that is an aspect of American politics. But the formula for that Republicans used in the late 1960s and the late 20th century was a winning formula. You know, it was interesting, in the late 1920s, most Democrats didn't want to refer to themselves as liberal, because liberal was a bad word. They might say they're progressive. And if you think about today's politics, Bernie Sanders runs as a socialist and does pretty well. No one would dare run as even a liberal, let alone a socialist in the late 20th century. So what's happening then today in the 21st century? There is some third-party action. Although I'm kind of impressed that it's relatively weak. I'm sort of surprised, especially this year, when there's so much dissatisfaction with the major party candidates. This was a tremendous opening for a strong third-party candidate. But somehow, third parties haven't emerged with significant strength. Or in this era when lots of people are concerned about climate change, how come the Green Party isn't stronger? One answer might be that the existing two-party system is still meeting the needs. The Democratic Party is still green enough, and it still holds together the political issues that are facing us today. I think another change in recent elections has been an increase in turnout. And for Obama, you saw the increasing turnout a lot among younger people. Turnout among ethnic minorities is increasing. One answer or one explanation of the increasing turnout might be polarization of American politics. It's because the two candidates are a little more different today than they used to be. People realize that a lot's at stake, and sometimes that does drive them to the polls. I'm interested to see what turnout is this year, because these two candidates this year are just not very popular. And so kind of the question is, what kind of turnout will they get? I think it's going to be pretty respectable. So what are the changes in the air? Might this be the beginning of a realigning era? I think a lot of Democrats think it's not going to be a huge realignment, but just one that will cement their majority status for upcoming years. I was listening to James Carville on a talk show. He's a well-known Clinton advisor, strong Democrat. He made the comment that it's getting harder for Democrats to lose a presidential election. A lot of that has to do with demography, increasing number of ethnic minorities. I think there's also been changes in professional classes. And if people talk about the Obama coalition, it tends to be professional whites and ethnic minorities. And so in the professional class, it tends to be IT professionals, architects, many lawyers. They seem to be attracted to the Democratic Party. So that would be sort of one view of the future, largely like today, and maybe a realigning or a shift fueled by demography. Probably another school of thought would maybe say there are some issues today that might cause an upending of American politics. I'm interested in the free trade issue, for example. In the late 20th century, Bill Clinton, of course, led the way in terms of his advocacy of free trade. And there was a split in the Democratic Party over free trade. Hillary Clinton advocated free trade, and apparently in one of her hacked emails, she made a stronger statement in favor of free trade. It seems to me that Hillary Clinton and George H.W. Bush have more in common on trade than Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. That is, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are ardently opposed to free trade. Could that be an emerging division? And I think one, if you look ahead to 2020, what are all these so-called establishment Republicans going to do? If the Republican Party remains a Trump party, the wing of the party led by people like Jeb Bush and John Kasich are not going to sit idly by, and probably there is a potential there for some shift. I don't know if they become Democrats or they form a third party. I think back in the day, Will Rogers famously used to say, I don't belong to any organized political party, I'm a Democrat. And I think today you'd almost have to say the reverse. I mean, the Republicans are looking awfully disorganized today, and I think the question is, how do they stitch it together? Does a new party emerge? But perhaps one possible new party might be a more globalist party, led by Hillary Clinton and George H.W. Bush and Barack Obama, favoring free trade, and a more localist party. I don't know if it can go that far. That's probably a strong speculation. I think another big issue in the future might have to do with this issue of socialism. Kind of amazing how well Bernie Sanders did this year. Kind of amazing how strongly students supported him. What does that mean? Does it mean that students are losing their faith in the free market? Or is Bernie Sanders just kind of pushing, not exactly, Bernie Sanders didn't push too many socialist ideas, in my view. Single-payer health care is, in large measure, a socialist idea. But kind of tougher regulation of Wall Street isn't necessarily a socialist idea. Now, having a national bank, which has been on the agenda of American politics in the past, that would be a socialist idea. I don't exactly know how socialist Bernie Sanders is, but clearly it's interesting. I don't know what it means that lots and lots of young people embraced Bernie Sanders. Is it their waning job prospects that are leading them to look for something different? I'm not sure. I think another interesting aspect of this year has to do with the working class, particularly the white working class. It must drive Bernie Sanders crazy that they're not supporting him. I mean, what could be better for the white working class than single-payer guaranteed health care and free college tuition? Yet the white working class is moving to Donald Trump. And I think that's, Donald Trump has said plenty of offensive things this campaign. I'm sort of almost tired of talking about them. But I think it is interesting to know that some of the most economically vulnerable people are flocking to him. They really believe that these trade deals with China and increasing flows of immigration, that's what's hurting them. He's been able to convince them of that. And I think historically, the white working class has been a bulwark of the Democratic coalition. And so it is sort of interesting that that seems to be moving over to the Republican Party, or at least to Donald Trump. I think the other aspect of the Republican Party does have to do with the white working class. What is it that led them to spurn? There were 17 candidates, and there were some pretty impressive candidates. And Donald Trump was, of course, the biggest outlier, and he trounced the whole remaining field. What is it that led that? And I think for a lot of the white working class, they do feel betrayed by the Republican establishment. An establishment they feel didn't lead to smaller government, didn't lead to increases or help in their own pocketbooks. And I think it will be interesting to look at what kind of politics we'll see in the future. But I think college students, socialism, the white working class, I think race is, of course, another issue with Black Lives Matter this year that's interesting. I think what's interesting about some of these radical movements, like Black Lives Matter or the Occupy movement, is they don't seem to be accompanied by specific pieces of legislation. Remember when the Occupy movement was in Wall Street, can anyone name one specific thing they're for? They were just sort of protesting inequality. And I think Black Lives Matter, probably if you talk to them, they would advocate specific changes in the way we do policing, specific changes in the way we train police, and maybe affirmative action to get a more diverse police corps. But yet, in the broader public, I think those things aren't exactly what you first think about when you think about Black Lives Matter. So I don't know how those factor in. Largely, they've been, in some measure, not so much Black Lives Matter, outside the realm of presidential politics. But sometimes the radical fringe, maybe in some ways they are the kind of third party of their time. So, well, I thought we should leave lots of time for questions, and I bet there may be some, I hope so. So why don't we open the floor?
Let's wait for that. We've got the people with mics to come. Here, I'm going to ask a question while we get to.
I was very interested in the reaction of the Republican Party in 2012 when Obama won and Romney lost. Assuming Clinton wins, what do you predict the reaction of the Republican Party will be?
Well, of course, one reaction to the Republican Party was, with Mitt Romney, was we just about had it perfect. We just have to tweak it a little bit. If we come up with a more open immigration policy, that will be enough to get us a few more percentage points and we can win the White House. It was largely the goal of George W. Bush. George W. Bush in Texas won pretty significant percentages of the Latino vote. And he was in favor of more open immigration and more of a path to citizenship. So Republicans thought if they could just tweak that a little bit. And so politicians like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio seemed to fit that bill. But you know, what do the generals say about battle plans? It only lasts until the first shot is fired. That was sort of the thing with that plan. It didn't work. A Republican leader advocating more open immigration was just a losing formula. I don't know what the Democrats will do if Hillary Clinton wins. One interesting fact historically is it's really hard for one party to hold the White House for 3 terms. I think 5 out of the last 6 times they failed. George H.W. Bush was the only person that succeeded. And of course he succeeded and he only lasted 1 term. You wouldn't have to be a rocket scientist to predict a pretty rocky road for Hillary Clinton. Although I think her record in the New York Senate would suggest that she's going to work pretty hard to put up some bipartisan legislation, probably the infrastructure, maybe some sort of tax reform. But you know, Hillary Clinton is a pretty tenacious politician, and I think particularly if the Democrats don't capture Congress, I think she's going to work really hard at putting that forward. And she was a pretty popular senator. She has not been a very popular presidential candidate, but I think she's a popular senator because she was seen as kind of a workhorse, not a show horse. Now, I think it's harder as president to be a workhorse and to leave out the show horse part of your job description, but I think she's going to try.
What part do you think the technology and the internet in particular play in the polarization that we're seeing across the country? Because my observation has been that technology allows us to kind of self-select, and there's a lot of the sound one-hand clapping.
Yeah, you mean I can pick the cable station I'm going to listen to, or I can pick the news outlet I'm going to listen to. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think also just the way in which some of these things go viral, the way in which people change. I was listening to Anita Hill on public TV the other day, and someone was asking, what would social media, how would that have changed if there was social media back in that day? It might have been a different outcome. I'm not sure. But I think clearly there is a lot of picking and choosing of the media. You know, back in the day, you knew who the main news anchors were. It was, Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw. I think now most Americans could hardly name who the main news anchors are.
First of all, thanks for your talk. I think it's fascinating. You spoke of third parties and what might become of third parties through this. I think the election system itself, the voting method, borderline guarantees 2 parties, and so personally I've advocated for ranked choice voting for years, so I'd be curious your opinion on ranked choice voting, and if this is a pivotal election that sets up for change, not only with the parties themselves, but do you think there's opportunity with the voting system?
Well, there are, as you alluded to, lots of obstacles to third parties. I mean, the biggest one is single-member districts, plurality elections. So if you do really well as a third party, like Ross Perot did, what you end up with nothing. As opposed to a proportional system where typically you would get seated in Parliament in proportion to the percentage of vote you get in the election. That being said, at different moments in American history, third parties have been successful and they have influenced the course of American politics. So the obstacles, even without something like ranked choice voting, aren't insurmountable. The typical third party in American political history has, I can't remember who said this, but kind of the role of the third party has typically been to sting like a bee and then die. And so typically they have some short-term success, and then one of the parties will absorb it. And so Nixon does that with his Southern strategy of George Wallace. Clinton, in large measure, did that with Ross Perot. The only lasting third party in American politics, of course, was the Republican Party. Other than that, usually they've been more short-term. In Minnesota, we had a farmer labor party that didn't exactly die, but it kind of grafted or it merged with the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. So, you know, it's not clear that third parties can't flourish without ranked choice voting. I don't exactly know what I think about it. I think sometimes when I've looked at some of those Minneapolis ballots, they're just so long. It's just hard to imagine how you can unpack it all. I don't know if there are a simpler version of ranked choice voting, or maybe you only get to rank 3 candidates or something like that. But you're right, we do have a system where today, or in 2000, you couldn't vote for Ralph Nader without hurting Al Gore. And so a lot of people voted for Al Gore, not everyone, of course, and I think probably that reality did change the election. I'm sort of mixed on ranked choice voting. I mean, I think one consequence of ranked choice voting might be it makes it too easy for third parties, and third parties become kind of an interest group, and they can just exist. Whereas in the current system we have, you have to be good enough to become lots of people's first choice, and that it is a challenge. And in large measure, you know, if you look at third-party options today, the Libertarians and the Greens, I don't think either one of them really are ready for prime time. And you know, what would ranked choice voting do? Maybe they would get a few more. So I'm kind of mixed on ranked choice voting. Not ardently opposed, but I'm not ready to support it full bore.
So I keep thinking back to the election that Howard Dean ran in, and he had the scream that was just a little too enthusiastic. People said, nope, that's not going to fly for a presidential candidate. How have we, so many times in this election, I've caught myself thinking, wow, that's going to be the thing. You definitely can't do that. And then I keep being surprised. How is it that we've gotten to where we are in such a short period of time?
Yeah, that's true. Why is it that the scream did Dean in and not something else? Apparently in 1976, I think Gerald Ford ate a tamale wrong, and it really hurt him in the Latino vote. You know, I think he ate the shell and was supposed to peel it off or something like that. So why is it?
For Al Gore's side.
And somehow that became symptomatic. Or I think George H.W. Bush once went to the grocery store and he didn't know what a scanner was because he hadn't been to the grocery store for a while. So why haven't we had more of those moments? Yeah, I don't know. Is it a change in our culture, or I kind of think you sort of get the feeling that people want to elect someone like Donald Trump, and that if he could only stop doing these offensive things and he would just simply be a savvy businessman who's for tougher immigration and tougher trade policy, I think he might win. And I think the fact that he can say all these outrageous things and not lose, I think, is one indication, one indicator of that.
Do you have any comments or insights you could speak on if the uptick of international influences of countries, organizations, or money are influencing what's going on today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wish I had a good answer. Yeah, this hacking, to me, it seems kind of idiosyncratic. I think Putin just had some hackers in Russia do something. I don't know if it's part of a broader trend, but certainly cybersecurity and cyber warfare, you got to think in 15 or 20 years we're going to be talking a lot more about that. And as the Obama administration considers how they counter Putin, I think that'll be an interesting development. In terms of foreign money and foreign influence, I think there's probably less of that. I think if Clinton wins, it's not because of the Clinton Foundation. I think there are stronger forces at play there.
Linda has the mic.
Could you talk a little bit more about how you think the campaign financing laws are contributing to keeping our system in just a two-party system and preventing any kind of reasonable voice coming in the middle? And
well, I had an op-ed in the Star Tribune earlier this year, and my first sentence was, "Big money is a loser this year." And I think Donald Trump would be one example of that. He hasn't spent much money, hardly run any ads. Jeb Bush outspent him 20 to 1 or 10 to 1, something like that, and yet Donald Trump was able to prevail. And on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders was able to raise lots of money, but almost none of it was in large sums. Most of his, I think 80% of his money came $200, $200 or less. So I think big money can be overstated, particularly at presidential politics. I think where I'd be more worried about big money would be in legislative races,
Not so
maybe
much
congressional
about
races.
big contributors, but just the fact that they're always trying to raise more money than anyone else, and is the polarization of their message contributing to just raising more money to be heard, and then it doesn't allow anyone else to speak.
Maybe repeat what Linda said.
So I think the question is, does the very fact of raising money, maybe, I think what I understand you to say is that the phone's in the room, and the other third parties have to fight and claw and scream. I think that might be true, but again, we shouldn't let third parties off the hook. It might be also that their message just isn't strong enough, just doesn't resonate enough. I mean, is Gary Johnson failing because he doesn't have enough money? Or Jill Stein, is she failing because she doesn't have enough money? Maybe. I mean, not completely disagreeing with you, because there is a green argument or a libertarian argument that seems to be a bit muted. But I think money. I wouldn't say money has no influence or isn't part of the picture, but I think particularly in presidential politics, I think if Donald Trump had run as a third party, that would have been interesting, and I think he would have done pretty well because he did have a message that resonates. You might disagree with it, but it did resonate.
Dan, let's take one more question, I think.
Do you have a question? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom.
Do you want to make a forecast for the winner for the 2nd, 3rd, and 8th congressional districts?
Well, the 2nd district, that's where Northfield is. Angie Craig, the Democrat, is out fundraising the Republican Jason Lewis. Seems like she's going to win. And up until recently, I thought that Stuart Mills might win. I think Eric Paulson will hold on to his seat. I'm not just saying that because he's an oldie, but he's. I think he's done what a lot of members of Congress do when they run, is to be moderate and to avoid controversy. And that's sort of the way Congress works. There's a scholar who wrote a book about Congress who said what members of Congress typically do is they advertise, they claim credit, and they take positions on issues when they're advantageous. So I think you haven't seen Eric Paulson on the vanguard of, he doesn't sound like Donald Trump, and I think that's probably a winning formula for Nolan. It might say Nolan as well, although, boy, that things are changing rapidly up in that 8th district.
Just a quick one?
Yeah, well, I would just wanted you to comment on, I read something on 538 this morning about the guy in Utah and his ability to be on the congressional ballot if there's a deadlock tie. McClellan?
Oh, right, he's the third party candidate in Utah,
Yeah,
and so if he wins,
in Utah.
then
And there's a
Utah's-
deadlock tie.
then Utah's electors would go to him. And so, right, that could factor in. I mean, it's a pretty small priority, small probability. I mean, you'd have to sort of think that it would be like 268 to 267, and then Utah has 4 electoral votes, and he could swing the tie.
But
So
would
it's
that
not-
be enough to get him on the ballot in Congress if there's a deadlock tie between the two party candidates?
It would be enough to get him on the ballot for the Electoral College. And so if he captures Utah, he would get the electoral votes of Utah. And so, but if there isn't a majority in the Electoral College, it would go to Congress, and it would be decided by the existing members of Congress. And so does Utah have 1 member of Congress, or 2, or 3? I'm not sure. But anyway, but each state would get 1 vote, and he would not be in Congress. He's not running for Congress, he's running for president.
No, but if Congress had to decide the election by a vote because it was tied.
Well, the Utah congressional delegation would decide. And they maybe would go for McMullen, because if he were to carry the state, but they may vote, they may not. All right, thank you very much.